Hello and welcome CX Today. My name is Charlie, and today I'm delighted to once again be joined by two excellent customer experience analysts to discuss the latest Gartner Magic Quadrant for CCaaS. Yes, today our two wonderful analysts are Dave Michaels, lead analyst at TalkingPointz, and Liz Miller, VP principal analyst at Constellation Research. Thank you both very much for joining me. I'm quickly just going to race into the main meat of this conversation, and that is, of course, the Magic Quadrant. And to start this, I will put up a picture of the Magic Quadrant grid on the screen for everybody watching to see, and I'll quickly explain it to everybody. I'll quickly explain to everybody how it works to get this conversation going. So there are 4 quadrants. In the top right, we have our market leaders. In the top left, our challengers. In the bottom right, our visionaries, and the bottom left, the niche players. So Gartner has placed its vendors on this grid vertically on their supposed ability to execute, and horizontally on their completeness of vision. And that will impact which of the 4 quadrants they're in. So the biggest highlights from 2022 to this year's edition is that Five9 has moved from a challenger to a leader, AWS has moved from a visionary to a leader, and Talkdesk has slipped down from a leader to a visionary. So yeah, those are probably the kind of 3 big talking points. But maybe, Davey, I'll start with you on this one. What was your kind of first reaction to seeing that grid?
Oh, I love the Magic Quadrant. It's one of my favorite reports, and I think they do a great job of putting this together. There's Gartner in particular has fantastic access to the vendors and a lot of enterprise data access. So I actually look forward to this report and read it very carefully every year and use it a lot throughout the year. Now that said, it's an opinion, and analysts have lots of opinions. So I don't always necessarily agree with everything about it, but I think they do a fantastic job, and it's their opinion. That's the main thing. And so this represents their opinion, and they're writing for their clients, which tend to be fairly large enterprises, global enterprises. And so one thing that's critical about on the Magic Quadrant is you don't really know the weighting criteria. And so it can be tricky to use a report like this for any company to use a report like this, because the weighting criteria is not clear. So, for example, Gartner puts a lot of emphasis on global reach. And if you are a company that doesn't require global reach, you're only in one country, or you're only in Europe or something like that, it's hard to adjust the weights on these charts to figure out how the scores would be for you. So it's a little tricky in that sense. So and Gartner gives us a little bit of clues about how they do their weighting, but they don't really publish a lot of detail on it, and so it's hard to manipulate the data. That said, I'm sure Liz and I are going to have some, we have our own set of opinions, and we're going to have some different views on this, which I think will be interesting. I think overall, I think it's a pretty good report. I kind of expected Five9 to move into the leaders quadrant. I thought that made sense. I definitely expected Amazon to move into the leaders quadrant. Last year in the accompanying report, the critical capabilities, Amazon had done really well. They're innovating very quickly there. And so I kind of expected that to happen. I did kind of expect Talkdesk to fall out. The rules changed. Talkdesk wasn't profitable or isn't profitable. And so the rules changed around raising money. And so they had to do a lot of cost cutting this past year. So not a big surprise there either. I kind of expected NICE to come up a little more to the upper right, and Genesys I was actually kind of expecting Genesys to fall out. So that was probably the biggest surprise for me on this particular report. Liz?
It's freaking me out just a little bit because, Dave, I pretty much entirely agree with everything you've said. And I want to give a moment so that if Dave were to fall down because of that, we could get him back into the screen and get him back into the frame. But no, I agree. I think that the challenge with the Magic Quadrant, I mean, this is a really good piece of research, right? They put a lot into it, and the vendors put a lot into it. And I think that can't be emphasized enough. being part of a Magic Quadrant analysis is an investment in time. It is an investment in resources. You are answering a lot of very specific questions. I mean, you are really committing if you are really being part of this. And so I applaud everyone who even took part in the process, because it is a very arduous process. But I agree. I think that the things that like surprised me were minor shifts. It wasn't anything like, oh my gosh, Talkdesk fell. I was like, yeah, Talkdesk. Like it wasn't that surprising. I think the thing that I hear the most from our clients about whether it's this specific Magic Quadrant or the Magic Quadrant in kind of writ large is that weighting challenge. And it's interesting that Dave brought that up, because I think that a lot of times the assumption is, and it's because Gartner isn't very specific about that, the assumption is that is marketing heavily weighted? So am I ever going to get past an organization where marketing is more heavily weighted than maybe, who knows what other section. So I think that tends to be a question that people ask. It's not necessarily a criticism of the Magic Quadrant. I think there is, though, a little of that murky area of, to Dave's point, I may not need global reach, and I may just need something that's kind of just gets to the point. I don't need all the marketing. I don't need all the bells and whistles. I just need something that's super solid, it's going to work. So I think a lot of times people do question that. As far as what appears on the Magic Quadrant, Talkdesk, I think everyone will nod their heads. Yeah, they're it's not surprising that it slipped from being a visionary. I think it's important to note that none of these quadrants are called so terrible I wouldn't implement it. So I think when we talk about things falling, like I think there tends to be a little bit of dread in that. Like they're still saying, like there's a visionary, they're still able to execute. They just might not be able to execute as well, as they did say in the last assessment. So I think it's important to think about that. I'm going to be honest. I think there's a ticking clock on how long Genesys stays in that uppermost left-hand quadrant. Because I think that, whether it is Amazon, whether it is AWS, whether it is Five9, whether it is NICE, there are solutions out there that are going to chase Genesys hard. And Genesys needs to keep that innovation engine rolling. They need to stay ahead of that curve. And I think that what a lot of us are seeing is they might not be doing that at the speed that we would expect that someone who wants to stay in that leaders quadrant is going to be at. I'm going to point out the one that actually did kind of surprise me. How long is Cisco going to stay up, even like close in that ability to execute high point becomes my question, right? I think that, I start to see Cisco. I mean, my if I were to bet on quadrants, if Dave and I were to start a pool, my bet would be that we start to see Cisco start to move, to kind of keep falling out of whatever that is. I mean, completeness of vision, really? How? I think there's some questions there.
Well, that's an interesting thread to pull. I'd like to try to cut you off there, Charlie. We should go back into Cisco here before we get into some more. And I want to talk more about Genesys too. But I just want to finish up the weightings. What makes the Magic Quadrant so interesting is, of course, this diagram which you've just shown, and it's one of the few analyst reports out there that does something like this. There's the Forrester Wave and just a few others, but. Gartner, at the same time as they published this, they published the critical capabilities, which is essentially 7, I might have my numbers wrong, 7 more Magic Quadrants. And what they've done is they've changed the weights. And so they have these different use cases. They say, oh, if you're trying to do this, one of them's a high volume, one of them's a digital only, digital only contact center. So they have all these different use cases. So if you're trying to do this is the way we would rank all the vendors. And so it's like another Magic Quadrant. Each one of those use cases is basically a re-ranking of all these vendors. And so it's really, if you take the original Magic Quadrant plus the critical capabilities, I think it's about 8 Magic Quadrants they published at the same time. So the weightings are really, really important. And it's a shame that there's such mystery around them. That's one area where Forrester does a slightly more transparent job of making their weightings a little more visible. Now, back into some of these vendors, it seems like we're pretty much in agreement on Genesys. We can talk a little bit more about that. But on the Cisco one, this report has existed. I think it started in 2020 when Gartner consolidated they had a European CCaaS Magic Quadrant. They had a Western European and a US, and then they consolidated. I think it was 2020. I might be wrong about that, but it was right around there. And they've been publishing this one report ever since then. This is the only report they publish on contact center because they stopped doing a Magic Quadrant on what they call contact center infrastructure, the premises-based solutions. So what I wanted to say about that is that every year that report has been almost identical. I mean, the dots have moved micro dots. I mean, it's been a very stable report. Actually, last year was probably the most significant shakeup because they added Cisco. So Cisco's only been in there for this is their second year, and they dropped like 4 vendors, and all the vendors they dropped were in the bottom left quadrant, the niche quadrant. And when you have to understand, there's no numbers on these quadrants, there's no axes, and so they actually try to get these things kind of centered. And so when they drop all the vendors out of one quadrant, they basically recenter everything. And so almost everybody is like a tide. Almost everybody kind of moves to the bottom and to the left when they do that. And so there was a big reset last year. Now, so that in mind, so on the Cisco point there, so Cisco appeared for the first time last year. And they had managed to do that primarily because of that acquisition, IMI Mobile. Right. And that kind of because they have a very strong presence in premises based solutions, but that doesn't qualify for this particular report. So it was IMI Mobile that really uplifted their CCaaS business and allowed them to fit into this report. And I think they pretty much came out unchanged this year. I think the dot's pretty close to where it was last year. So Liz thinks it's going to go down, and I can understand that conclusion because Cisco's commitment doesn't seem as high as it has in other areas. The way you can tell Cisco's commitment is acquisitions, and there hasn't really been a lot of acquisitions other than IMI Mobile. Excuse me. But that said, that IMI Mobile's done quite a bit, and I think that Cisco may actually end up doing pretty well. Not so much because of their own investment, but because I think the contact center space is kind of shifting a little bit. And the criteria that's used in this Magic Quadrant, we didn't really talk about that, what they call the inclusion criteria. That determines who gets to be in the report. And the inclusion criteria in this report is changing every year. They raise, there's a revenue requirement, there's a bunch of requirements, and the vendors have to meet that. Vendors don't get to choose whether they're in the report or not. And vendors don't have to participate either. If they meet the inclusion criteria, Gartner's going to put a dot down for them whether the vendor participates or not. Most vendors will participate. When I say participate, answer the questions, etc. But the inclusion criteria for this report are very traditional. One of the requirements, for example, is that 50% of your CCaaS revenue has to be from inbound voice. Now, that takes out a lot of vendors. That takes out companies like Sprinkler that are really strong in digital communications. It takes out Microsoft because Microsoft's got a digital-only contact center. It takes out a lot of solutions that are not in this report because they don't have 50% of their revenue, of their CCaaS revenue in inbound voice. So as these requirements evolve over time, they're going to shift who gets to be in this report. I believe that we're going to see the requirements shifting away from voice. What the vendors are mostly talking about today, if you talk to any one of these dots on this grid, they're talking about AI very heavily. They're talking about digital channels very heavily. They're talking about workforce engagement very heavily. They're talking about a lot of different things. They're not talking about ACDs. They're not talking about inbound voice. And so as the requirements change, the dots change. Now, Cisco ends up, the reason they're on there is IMI Mobile, which was their digital strategy, and they're also investing very heavily in AI in general. So I wouldn't dismiss Cisco necessarily. I think they might just end up running in place
Hold it
and
on.
coming out just fine.
Yeah. Yeah. I can see that. I mean, I think you're so right, Dave. I mean, I think that next year, this year was kind of like when I saw it, you kind of like, yeah, okay. Like you look at everything and you maybe see how some of the things shifted and you're like, I totally get that. I totally get that. Next year's going to be interesting, right? Because all of a sudden, does Zoom land on here? Does RingCentral land on here? Do we take a beat and relook at Avaya when we look on here? Do they hit the revenue threshold because of where they are, financially and with their financials? You all of a sudden have a couple different players that you're like, wait a minute, that could be really interesting just because of what's happened within the last 2 weeks when the world decided to turn itself on its head and everyone decided to be a CCaaS. So I mean, I think there's that next year's assessment is going to be very interesting.
I agree with all those dots you just mentioned, but you could, but based on what I said, you can look at companies like Salesforce, you can look at companies like ServiceNow.
Exactly.
I mean, there's they don't have to be traditional contact center companies.
And I think it also opens it up for those organizations that have not necessarily focused on inbound, but they've focused on outbound, but still have a robust agent experience, that still have. So all the other inclusion criteria, when they have that and they say, yes, we focus primarily on outbound, but we also have inbound capabilities. Well, does that start to tick the box? Like if we stop looking at directionality and we start looking at truly the capabilities of what a lot of organizations are looking for as they start to consolidate, not call center or contact center, but they really start to consolidate that engagement center, right? So very much to Dave's point, as that digital footprint begins to shift, where other channels are starting to take more of that precedence, where AI is beginning to take hold, who's to say, who's to say what's that top heaviest weight, on the scale? But I also think that's when it gets really, really, really interesting, because when you start to talk about what qualifies as being a visionary, what qualifies, does all of a sudden, are those the players that move kind of extremely to the right? They may not be in the leaders, but I think all of a sudden we're going to see a different crop of players, not so much in the niche, but really in that completeness of vision, where you're starting to see, okay, like, does Salesforce take a leap and end up farther to the right? I think becomes the question, like, where does that horse start to play?
Well, and so what's causing of this big shift that could be happening, we look at shifts that happened in past tense, so it's always hard to tell them in present tense. But is AI, of course, and so most of these dots on this grid right now are traditional agent models. In fact, their revenue model is price per agent per month. Typically, I think Amazon's usage based, but it's still per agent or transaction. And as we move more toward AI, that kind of changes that whole model, changes the financial model. When you change financial models, you have a fairly major disruption in what could happen in the vendor landscape. And so we are moving for the first time, and we've been talking about AI, particularly in contact center, for at least 5 years, maybe 10. It's hard to say when we started talking about it, but we're moving to a point where people are actually willing to interact with bots. Right? I'm calling it the change a reservation, something like that. And if I get a bot now, I'm screaming operator, representative, anything to get past this bot. But people are moving, or including myself, we're moving past that. I'll give the bot a chance. We're becoming more receptive to bots. And as we move more toward bots, that puts a lot more emphasis on the AI capabilities and the ability to manage data. We just saw, for example, Five9 acquire a company called ACS. And that's a data play, right? That's all about getting more access to data. It has to do with migrations. It has or implementations and migrations. It has to do with AI for data access for AI, and it also makes them an incumbent into a lot of these accounts that they may not be an incumbent vendor at. So really smart. Looks like a really smart acquisition. But this is about data now. It's not, again, we're not talking about ACDs. We're not talking about these other things. And so as we move into this, the AI is such a hard thing to know what the future is going to look like. I mean, we could possibly have a near future where there's no more thing as a hold when you call a contact center, because we don't need to have put people on hold to get to a bot. And so what has to happen for that to happen? We have to have bots that actually know how to communicate, which we seem to now have, and we have to have bots that can actually do things, which we don't have yet. And so to actually go into a system and change things and make things happen. But these things are coming, and so as these things come, we're going to see some fairly significant changes on a report like this.
And I also think that you potentially see a new category, right? And Gartner is not shy about creating new categories. And I think that we are going to see those new categories that focus in on whether it is a data-centric focus in what happens in kind of communications writ large that are cloud-based, whether it is AI-centric. I think that we're going to see some type of move here. I think that there are lots of different permutations of what that move starts to look like.
I want to say something to that, but I want to let Charlie just talk a little bit here as the host.
No, actually, I wanted to pick up on something you said earlier in regards to NICE, actually, and why perhaps you maybe expected them to be more the top right. But I don't know, Dave, if you quickly want to add in your point, and then we'll. And
so the issue with the Magic Quadrants there is that there's actually another Magic Quadrant that Gartner publishes that today has very little overlap. It's a conversational AI Magic Quadrant. And companies like Cognigy and Amelia and actually Amazon's the only vendor that's on both of these reports. And so it's a whole different set of vendors. And when I read that Magic Quadrant and read about what these guys are doing, it's like, this sounds like CCaaS. This sounds like they're doing the exact same thing. So why is there so little overlap? And it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the inclusion criteria. The inclusion criteria for this report is they have to have 50% of their revenue from inbound voice. Those companies don't have that kind of, they don't even qualify, right? And so those companies don't qualify. The inclusion criteria on the other report, the conversational AI report, says they have to be a standalone platform. Gartner likes the idea that I go buy a Cognigy for my enterprise, and my IT department will use it for sales, customer service. They'll use it for marketing programs. They'll use it for a highly versatile army knife for every kind of application. So to me, these are going right toward each other, and I think will be one Magic Quadrant at some point. You look at Cognigy; they've already aligned up with 8x8 and Avaya, and they're courting other CCaaS companies. This contact center is where the ROI is at, right? That's where you want to be, and Cognigy's gotten into a number of high-profile accounts now at airlines doing self-service, and so I think those Magic Quadrants could easily come together. And when I said that to some of the people before, they said, "How could that be? There's like no overlap." And it's like, well, there's no overlap by design, but these inclusion criteria evolve every year. So
I don't see them coming together. I mean, that's the one thing I will say. I don't, because mainly because those organizations and the criteria, not just the criteria, and that there are so many other applications that are not contact center based or not even service centric based, that conversational AI set is really looking at. I think that there is definitely going to be increasing overlap in the two, but I think Gartner's going to have to make that decision. Are we looking at tools that are IT and enterprise wide, or are we specifically looking at this as conversational AI as only as it applies to the contact center? And right now,
and so I agree with that. I understand what you're saying, but I've asked some of the contact center vendors on this chart if they will sell just a platform, a conversational AI platform to the HR department, and they said no, we don't do that today. Yeah. But they say we will tomorrow because we're investing heavily in this area, and that's an increase of TAM that we need to acknowledge. So that's what I'm saying. The contact center vendors are moving that way. The conversational AI vendors are moving this way, and so that's why I see the overlap. But
I would say the other list, Dave, to keep an eye on, which is going to be really interesting, and it's primarily because of that Five9 acquisition. Keep an eye on what happens with CDPs, right? Because at the end of the day, they bought a CDP, right? If it quacks like a duck and it walks like a duck, it's a duck, right? It's a customer data platform. So I think that you're going to start to see a lot of.
Did you just call Charlie a duck? Now. That's not nice.
I didn't call Charlie a duck. I called you a duck. You know I love you. So. But I do think that this is indicative of that bigger trend of the contact center and contact center vendors following a call to action that a lot of CIO and COOs who are making the decisions on who to bring in are starting to ask, which is, why are y'all sitting in a silo? Like, you have this really great tool here. You have a really great data set here. There's this huge corpus of data that's sitting within this solution, this platform.
Right.
Why are you sitting off by itself? So people are now starting to look, okay, where are those points of data integration? And with Five9, the question of, that, let's talk about that completeness of vision. What is that vision? My question was, back to Five9, what is that vision, right? So I think as we start to see these dots move next year, I'm really actually looking forward to the next one. Like, this one was great. It was cool to talk about. But like, next year's going to be interesting.
That brings us back to Genesys, because we get back to this AI capability, and NICE has a very strong AI capability. They've been doing it for a long time. They are investing heavily in generative AI now, but what they've developed over the past let's say decade of intent mapping and whatnot, they're in a pretty strong position. We've mentioned Five9 several times in their newest acquisition. And they had that acquisition of Inference a few years back. So they're also very strong. Amazon, very, very strong in AI. And so not a surprise there that Amazon has, and they're doing the data lakes, and they've also got the Chime SDK. So they're pulling all these pieces together. So the Amazon story is coming together. This is where one of the gaps for Genesys. I mean, they bought Bold 360, which I think is more or less been shut down. I haven't heard anything from Bold 360 in a while.
Nothing,
I don't know if it's been shut.
Yeah,
and so there's that transition, and then also when we look at the transition of, and this is what a lot of the vendors are talking about too, is this transition from customer service to a broader enterprise-wide. The code word for that is we're going from contact center to customer experience, where they're looking at much broader applications or implementations. This is where I get a little concerned with Genesys as well. I mean, they've last year when they discontinued their multi-cloud product, they really upset a lot of their customers. They really upset a lot of their channel partners. They've had a lot of leadership turnover in the past year. They've had layoffs multiple times. NICE, as far as I can tell, NICE and Five9 can't hire fast enough. In fact, we were at the Five9 event in Porto, and the guy that kicks off the event says, "Welcome to our office in Porto, Portugal. This used to be a Talkdesk office. I used to work at Talkdesk, but now it's all Five9." It's like, ooh, okay. So some companies are shrinking and some companies are growing, and so and Genesys is one that's been shrinking. And so now when they discontinued multi-cloud, they didn't actually discontinue. I get in trouble when I say that. When they basically told all their customers they're all in on one other product.
Yeah. Deprecated, I think.
When they did that, it really hurt a lot of their, like I said, their momentum and their customers. But Gartner doesn't look at that, because this Gartner Magic Quadrant in particular is about particular products. And so, in fact, they look at customer feedback, for example. They call it peer insights. They look at the peer insights, and so they look at the peer insights of Genesys Cloud, but not Genesys. And so the fact that all these customers are really upset doesn't factor into this type of report. So that, I think that's why we're a little surprised on the Genesys positioning.
Hey, Charlie, what do you think?
Yeah, I also figured, wait, they dropped a couple of cloud solutions, yet they're still they didn't drop at all. So that surprised me. But you've explained to me why now, which is really great. And just quickly, kind of the last, if you both have time, just one quick last point. I do want to talk on this NICE point and kind of want. And I was expecting them to see them kind of a bit further, maybe top right. I think in the Forrester Wave, they were the only. They were the only leader. I was kind of looking through their strengths. I noticed kind of workforce engagement management wasn't on there, process automation wasn't on there. Those are the two strengths that they're really well known for. I don't know if either of you could just add a little bit of color on that.
I'm not sure I understood the question. Did you get that, Liz?
Yeah, I think that for NICE, I think again it comes back to, I think where NICE falls. I think it does come back to what Dave and I have been kind of pulling the thread on already, which is that weighting. I mean, it's kind of hard to look at the criteria and be like, okay, well, NICE has all of that. And I think that from what we hear, and Dave, I don't know if you would agree with this, when I hear about customers and they say, I'm looking for some other thing. Oh, I have NICE. I love it. Like it's not, there isn't a visceral reaction to existing NICE customers that like they're looking for something else. They might be looking for little things. They might be looking to fill in gaps or fill in connections. And I think that where NICE has an opportunity is, they, quite frankly, a lot of the NICE opportunity, what I thought was really interesting in the Magic Quadrant report, a lot of the cautions, a lot of the things that they identified as issues with NICE were more about the people and some of the kind of the ancillary, what happens with customer success, what happens with training and knowledge, which is a little bit ironic, right? Like you could have a pretty good knowledge center there, guys. But, so I think it's some of the operational things around the company that kind of tend to fall in that kind of negative why they aren't higher up. So I think that's more around, NICE's company culture. People question NICE's marketing. They have a very strong marketing presence, right? People begin to question that. So I think that with NICE, I think the reality is that they have to, that NICE really, there's an opportunity to look at what got them a little bit lower and be like, okay, those could actually be fairly easy fixes. I think when I read the report, one of them was like, customers really don't like the documentation around the solution. And I'm like, it's a pretty easy fix, right? But I think what the bigger message for NICE is that as Genesys, to Dave's point, which I wholeheartedly agree with when it comes to Genesys, look at the reasons why people are questioning, should Genesys really be in that top section? Is there going to be moves there? Because I think a lot of the changes for NICE are really going to be around how do you amplify these other areas, whether it is the workforce management, whether it is kind of all these other tools and solutions. And to Dave's earlier point, the criteria are changing. The expectation is that's there. So I don't necessarily think that the NICE issue is technological or from an implementation standpoint. I honestly think it's some of the other, it's some of the other critical reasons of why people like doing business with, say, NICE or Five9 or, Genesys. And that's an opportunity for NICE because that's fixable.
I have to say I have yet to find anybody that feels that NICE should have been higher. Everyone agrees that NICE should have been higher that I've talked to so far. And so there's a lot of head scratching. I can't imagine what the folks over at NICE are doing. It's like, how did Genesys end up ahead of us? And so I think that there's a couple things that I want to hit on that Liz didn't mention. One is, if you go back to the contact center days, let's go back to, forget CCaaS, go back to buying a box and plugging it in on your premises. You bought a contact center engine, an ACD engine, and then you went and separately purchased a solution for workforce engagement. And there was a whole separate industry. Now, when we move that to the cloud, the CCaaS service scope has been expanding. And this is the first year that in this Magic Quadrant we're talking about that Gartner actually defines workforce engagement as part of CCaaS. It's always been kind of an optional add-on. If you look at every CCaaS provider, has added a workforce engagement either through acquisition or building their own and trying to build that up. NICE is the only one that came from the other direction. They were strong in in WFO. I'm getting my acronyms mixed up here. They were really strong in WFO, and then they went and acquired a CCaaS company. They're the only one that did this. They're the only one that came the other way.
Yeah.
And I think that's given them a huge benefit. Now, when you look at their cautions on this particular report, Charlie, two of these cautions are give me's. I mean, one of them is NICE offers optional specialized best of breed WAM. It's like, oh, that's a terrible caution. They have the best of breed workforce engagement solutions. It's like, oh,
don't look at them for that. Don't look at that for them.
And then the third one, there's only three. The third one on the cautions is some customers would express some concern, but the CX1, which is what we're talking about, generally doesn't have these concerns and is considered customers express satisfaction. It's like another big ouch. Oh my gosh, the customers in the exact evaluated product are expressing satisfaction. So I think they went out of their way to I think NICE is in a very strong position. I guess is my point.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah,
think
I think
everyone,
that
yeah.
also linked very well with what you said actually as well, as didn't it, in terms of the documentation, as you both mentioned, they're easy fixes. So maybe it's something that can improve in the near
And doesn't
future. I'm
involve
sure we can talk
engineers.
a lot. Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah, I'm sure there's so much more to talk about as well in terms of the kind of maybe why a bit more about why Talkdesk sit down, maybe who we expecting to come in next year, and kind of also the conversation around how contact center users leaders can use this report. But I think I might have to put that on ice for another day, just because we're running out of time. But I very much appreciate both of you for joining the conversation. It was great. I think you bounced off of each other wonderfully. It makes my job very easy. So thank you very much for joining me today. And also thank you to everybody for watching. Bye for now.